everybody, it's Courtney and I am here with another video for Scrapping for Less. Today I'm going to be creating 3 cards using the September 2018 Flavor of the Month card kit. I'm starting off here with the stamp from La La Land Crafts, and I'm just going to be stamping out this little girl. I'm not inking up the sentiment that is also part of the stamp. And I'm stamping this onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm going to speed up the coloring a lot here. So I'm starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. Then I'll move on to the E04, which is my darkest color, concentrating the darkest areas being underneath her hair, on the inside of her arms and her legs. Moving on to my 2 mid-tone colors, extending those areas out a little bit further. And then I'll go back in with my lightest color and just keep that highlight on the outside of her arms and legs and in the middle of her face. I'll go in with my R20 just to add a little bit of color to her cheeks and her lips. Next, I will move on to the yellows, just because this is an easy color to hide if I make a mistake. So I'm just filling in my areas with my lightest yellow here, just to kind of map these out. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color and just add a little bit of shading on either side of her little dress there, and in these little pleats, I guess you'd call them, and on each side of her little headband and on the outer part of her shoes. Next, going in with mid-tone, blending that out a little bit further, and then finally back to that lightest color and blending everything out. Next, I'm going to kind of skip around here a little bit. I'm going in with her hair, and I'm going to be doing really basic coloring here for her hair. I'm going to start off with my darkest color, which is the E59, and my darkest areas are going to be where her hair is parted on either side, and I'm just using the tip of my marker, doing various lengths of flicks here, and I'll also add some shadows to the middle part of her hair there. Next, I'll go in with the E57 and blend all of those flicks out a little bit further. I'm not looking for a realistic look here. I'm just worrying about shading, really. Next, I'll go in with the E55, blend those areas out a little bit further, just leaving a very small highlight for my E53. Next, I'll go in with the black areas of her little dress and her little antennas there. And I'm going to be using my C markers. I'm actually not using any black at all. I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which is the C7, and just mapping out the darkest areas on either side, basically doing the same shadowing as I did with the yellows. For those pleats on the top part of her little dress there, I just went on the outer edge of each of the lines that are built in within the stamp. And for that middle one there, I just added a little bit of shading right there in the center. Next, I'll go in with the C5, blend all of that out, and then a little bit further with the C3. I did go back in with those same yellows to add a little bit more of the yellow to the bottom part of her dress, so that those little sections are every other one for black and yellow, and also her little sleeves as well. And I'm using the same yellow combination as I did for the rest of it. Now for her little wings, I didn't want to leave these white. I did want a little bit of color, but not too much. So I'm going to go in with my BG70, which is super light. And I'm just flicking from the inside of her little wings there and flicking that out to white. For the little flowers that she's holding there, I'm going to go in with some more BG markers. Just add a little bit of shading to the center with the BG13 and blend that out with the BG11. Once my coloring was all done, I went ahead and cut this out with a oval die, and I'm going to be using the pattern paper that is from the same collection here. And I cut one piece that is slightly smaller than an A2 size card, and then a center strip that is the same length, but obviously shorter than my outer panel there. And I use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere all of these pieces flat onto a black A2 size card base. And for my sentiment strip, I used the back of one of the scrap pieces of the pattern paper that is a dark gray that matches the pattern paper perfectly. So I'm going to treat this with my anti-static tool and ink up just the bottom part of the stamp with Versamark ink where the sentiment is. Stamp that down, sprinkle on some white embossing powder, and heat set that. Next, I took my Scotch foam tape and popped up my little oval die cut there, as well as my sentiment strip. I cut off the excess of that little strip with my scissors, just cutting along the line of the card base itself. And I added a little bit of sparkle to her wings with the Spectrum Noir sparkle pen. And that is it for the first card. For my second card, I'm going to be using this girl that is holding her little pumpkin spice latte and two of the pieces of patterned paper from the kit, but a different collection. And I'm going to cut down this polka dot paper to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and the plaid paper just a little bit smaller. I think I cut this to 3 3/4 by 5 just so that I had a border. And with the scrap piece of the polka dot paper, I'm going to stamp my image there as well as a piece of Nina Solar White. I'm going to do most of my coloring on the white panel, but I'm going to be doing a little paper piecing with this. So once I had my images or my image stamped out, we're going to move on to the coloring. And again, I'm going to speed this up quite a bit. I'm going to color her skin the same way as I colored the previous little girl. So I'm going to speed right through that, starting with my lightest color, going to my darkest. I'm using the same color combination as I did with the first little girl as well. Next, we'll move on to her hair. And again, going to color these the same way as I did with the first one. Her hair is a little bit different than the first little girl. I'm concentrating on the little sections of hair because she's kind of got some tucked behind and some overlapping each other. So I'm just concentrating my shadows being where her certain strands of hair are hanging over other strands of hair. Again, just doing small flicks, all different lengths with just the tip of my marker with my darkest color first. Again, concentrating on those shadows where one piece of hair is hanging over another. Next, I'll go in with my E57 and blend all of that out a little bit, extending those flicks, just leaving a highlight pretty much there in the center of each of the strands of hair. And I'm going to skip right over the E55 because I'm looking for a little bit more contrast and I didn't want it to blend too much. So I'm going to go in with my E53 and just blend the rest of that out. Next, we'll move on to her sweater, and I'm starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. My shadows are going to be on either side of her little turtleneck there, on the inside of her arm where it's bent, and there's lines built within the image that will kind of show you where the fabric may be folded a little bit, so you'll want to add a little bit of dark color there. Putting a little bit of shading on either side. I'm just using a center light source here, a little bit on the bottom, just because her shirt looks to be kind of bunched up on the bottom. So I wanted to make that appear like it was. So I'm going to put a little bit of shading underneath her shirt as well. Next, going in with my darkest color, pretty much just going over those same areas that I had mapped out earlier, concentrating on just those little lines that are part of the illustration. Those are there to help you and guide you as to where your shadows should be. So make sure you pay attention to those. Just doing small little flicks from the bottom of her little shirt there. I don't want to extend that too far. Next, I'll go in with my darkest mid-tone, extend all of those areas out a little bit, and also add a little bit more shading in some of the areas that I kind of skipped that darkest color. You don't necessarily have to put your darkest color in every single dark area. In order to get the contrast, you want to make sure that you only use that sparingly. Next, I'll go in with my lightest mid-tone and extend that out even further, just leaving a small highlight. There's not going to be much of a highlight on the top of her shirt. Most of that is going to be covered with her hands and her little mug there, but there's going to be pretty strong highlight there on the bottom part of her shirt. I'm going to go in with my E35 and blend the rest of that out. Now I am mixing my YRs and my Y markers. They blend really well together, so don't be afraid to mix color families when you're doing your blending. I took just two YR markers to add a little bit of color to that pumpkin that is on her mug. And I will take my C3 and my C1 marker just to add a little bit of shading to either side of the mug. This is a round object, so you want to make sure that your highlight stays there in the center. For her shoes, I'm going to be coloring these black, and I'm using, again, those same C7, C5, and C3 markers. And I forgot her little skin there on her feet, so I did go back in with those same colors that we used for the rest of her skin tone to add those colors. Next, for the pattern paper, I'm just adding a little bit of shading with my C3 and my C1. I already have the color and the pattern from the pattern paper, so I'm not worried about too much shading there. I went ahead and fussy cut her pants out there, and I went right along the black line with that, and I fussy cut her out as well, leaving a small white border as if I used a die cut. Next, I'll adhere my panels together, and I will use that same Tombow Mono multi glue to adhere her little pants back onto the main stamped image there. It's best to use wet glue for this because it gives you a little bit of time to kind of move it around to where it needs to be. Once that was done, I added my sentiment from that same stamp set, and I wanted to heat emboss this, but I wanted it to be a bold black image. So I'm going to treat my panel with my anti-static tool again, stamp my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, use some clear embossing powder, and heat set that. Now I should have done this before I adhered my panels together. Whenever you use your heat tool, this will remelt your adhesive no matter which adhesive you decide to use. So I did get a little bit of warping, but once I adhered this to a card base, you couldn't really tell. So once I had my sentiment heat set, I popped my little girl there up with some Scotch foam tape, and there are some sequins that are part of the kit as well, and I scattered those throughout the card panel there above and below the sentiment, adhered those with some glossy accents, and that is it for card number 2. For my third card, I'm going to be using a piece of the pattern paper from the kit, and this paper is so pretty that I didn't want to cover too much of it up. So I'm going to be stamping my little latte image here with this is a Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. This is a no line coloring ink, but there's several out there that you can use, whatever one you're comfortable with. And I'm going to be obviously doing some no line coloring here. Starting off, usually I start with my lightest color. I'm starting off with my darkest color here, just adding shading to either side of this cup, and I'm using my warm grays here. And I wasn't getting enough contrast, so I went back in with my W5, added a little bit more shading on either side of the cup, blended that out with my W3, and then finally the W1, keeping the highlight right there in the center. Being this is a round object, you want to make sure that that highlight remains in the center. For the lid, I'm going to be switching over to some C markers, just kind of going over those lines, adding a little bit of shading on either side with the C3, and then blending that out with the C1. For the sleeve of the cup, I'm using my E30 markers, starting off with my lightest color. Again, the shading would be on either side, going in with my E37, just doing small little flicks on either side, blending that out with the E33, and then finally back to that E31. For the pumpkin, I'm going to be using the lines within the stamp. Now, you're going to lose these lines once you start your coloring because this is obviously no line coloring. So I'm starting off with my lightest color. My shading here is going to be on top and on the bottom of the pumpkin. And I'm varying the lengths of my flicks just because I wanted to add a little bit of texture. I went directly over the lines that are built within the stamp, blending that out with my mid-tone, and then finally my lightest color. For the, is it a stem? Well, I don't know what this would be, but the top part of the pumpkin. I'm starting with my lightest color, extending that out with my darkest color, including the lines within the stamp, blending it out with my mid-tone, and then finally the lightest color. Basically did the same thing with the leaves here, starting with my lightest color, then the darkest, then the mid-tone, and then my lightest color again. And now for this long grass or plants that are behind my little cup there, I'm just going to go over that with my darkest color. And then once I go back in with my lightest color, I'm going to go over those same lines with the lightest color to kind of make them a little bit smoother. Next, for the little stars that are part of the stamp, I just went in with a solid color. I used one of the colors that I used for the pumpkin. Next, I'm going to go ahead and die cut this with a circle die, and I wanted to add a little bit of ground to my little images here. So I'm going back in with my W markers, my W3 and W1, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading underneath the pumpkin and cup, and then I'll go in with my C or my W1, blend that out and extend that out through underneath my little plants there. Then I ran this through my die cutting machine. I cut my pattern paper just slightly smaller than an A2 size card base, and I kind of played around with my placement here because I wanted to keep as much of that pattern paper showing as possible. I couldn't decide how I wanted to add my sentiment. So I ended up taking one of the little circle tags that are part of the card kit, and I'm going to be stamping my sentiment on that. That way I can still see a ton of that beautiful pattern paper from behind that. Once I was happy with my placement, I went ahead and adhered my pattern paper flat to a craft card base with my Tombow Mono multi glue. I also adhered my colored image there flat to the lower left-hand corner with that same glue. And I stamped my sentiment from the same stamp set with Cup of Joe ink by Hero Arts. And I used it's not really twine, it's kind of like a rope. And it's from the latest card kit, from the October 2018 card kit. And the hole in the tag was just a little bit too small for this. So I used my hole punch to make that a little bit wider and threaded through my little rope there. Now the tag was a little bit too thin and I pulled a little bit too hard. It ended up ripping my tag. So I re-stamped it on a different tag and I layered them up a little bit just for stability. There's quite a few of these tags in the card kit, so I wasn't worried about wasting them. I just adhered them together with my Tombow Mono multi glue, rethread my rope there, and popped that up with my Scotch foam tape right above my little colored image there. And that is it for the third card. That's it for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day.